I wear a lot of hats here at the museum, but my primary focus is on managing our collections and making them available to the public. So with that in mind, I'm here today to talk to you about two relatively new groups of material that we're working on cataloging that have a lot of research potential and will be available to the public soon. I also want to talk generally about what you can find in our collection and how you can find it. The title of this presentation, Researching the Researchers, History of the Saranac Laboratory. Many of you might be asking, what is the Saranac Laboratory? And this little postcard here is the laboratory as it was first built in 1884. It was built for Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau, who had started what we refer to as the TB industry here in Saranac Lake in the 1880s. It was the first laboratory in the US for studying tuberculosis, and it was built to be fireproof after a fire in Dr. Trudeau's original laboratory burned down the lab and his house. At the time, this was a state-of-the-art scientific facility with ventilation, but no electricity. This is why the building looks the way it does, and I think we're really lucky for it. We actually get to work in a tremendously beautiful setting, in addition to being cool history. The huge windows you see here brought in a lot of light so that you could use a microscope without needing electricity. The glazed brick interior, which if you've been there, you'll see some photos if you haven't. Glazed brick is both fireproof and easily cleaned, but it also reflects sunlight to brighten the space. Additions in the 1920s expanded, hold on, I forgot to click my slides, expanded it to how it looks today. And it included a research library and more office space for the growing facility. And now this laboratory was in operation at the site until 1964, at which point it sort of morphed into the Trudeau Institute, which still continues in Saranac Lake today. And of course, this is what the museum looks like today. Maybe not today, it's actually really sunny and nice, but you can see the addition on the left-hand side. So you're also probably asking the TB industry. Now forgive me if you've been to the museum before, and this is a very abbreviated version of this history. But Dr. Trudeau came to the Saranac Lake area and stayed at Paul Smith's Hotel on his deathbed. He was planning to basically spend his last days in peace after he discovered his own case of tuberculosis. But he recovered and wanted to figure out what it was about being here in the Adirondacks that helped him, and also give others the opportunity to seek treatment. He opened what was then called the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium in 1884, and it was a roaring success. Patients came from all over the country and eventually the world for the fresh air cure for TB. This was a therapeutic treatment for TB in a general way, rather than a pharmaceutical one like taking antibiotics. And patients would spend their days in the fresh air on cure porches, resting and avoiding the stresses of daily life. They had diets that were high in fat and protein. And they also sought support for their mental health through occupational therapy, friendship, religion, and so on. We don't have exact statistics for a variety of reasons, but we believe conservatively that some 60,000 patients came to cure here, either in sanatoria or cure cottages that popped up all over the village. In a lot of ways, this was the founding industry for the village. It went from an unincorporated hamlet of about 500 people to a village of about 10,000 at its peak. And it also brought lots of associated industries, such as industrial laundry facilities and dairies. For example, the patients would drink up to 8 glasses of milk a day. So the sanatorium and most of the cure cottages around the area closed in 1954 after about 70 years. These are some cure cottages up at Trudeau here in this photo. They all had these big front porches eventually that would allow the patients to sit out in the fresh air. And here's a great photo of some patients out taking the cure in their cure chairs. These were unique furniture pieces that would allow you to rest. You could even sleep in them. They would recline fully. You take your meals, you'd read, socialize. And then just for fun, this is one of our most popular ever social media posts we've ever had. Can you spot why? So we got Bernie here taking the cure with the patients. Historic Saranac Lake operates the Saranac Laboratory the Saranac Laboratory as a museum to the TB industry, as well as general Saranac Lake history. HSL got started in 1980 as an architectural preservation organization to preserve the unique architecture of the cure and the TB industry in Saranac Lake. And in its initial decade, the organization nominated more than 6 historic districts and hundreds of individual buildings to the state and national registers of historic places. These days, there are about a dozen districts and more than 250 buildings listed. We still assist with register nominations, but we've shifted some of our focus to running the museum. We took ownership of the Saranac Laboratory building in 1999 and spent almost a decade restoring the space and opened it as a museum in 2009. So we used historic photos like this one to show us what it looked like because it had been heavily modified during its life as a dorm and classroom building for Paul Smith College students who were working at Hotel Saranac. We also started developing a collection somewhat organically at that point. We didn't have an archivist or curator on staff, so as with many small history organizations, things sort of accumulated, and we've had some issues with items for which provenance is unknown, of course. We have more than 20,000 objects in the collection. This is a really broad estimate because of the state of past donations, but it's in the many tens of thousands at this point. These days we have collections policies that help us guide our work, but one of my main focuses right now is on trying to reconcile as much of our collection as we can, as we're about to undertake a major construction on the Trudeau building, which will involve making a dedicated, secure, and climate-controlled storage space for collections. So we don't want to be moving any material that isn't organized or accounted for. And in case you haven't been out to the museum yet, this is what it looks like today. So you can see it's pretty faithful to those historic photos. And then this is the Trudeau building, if you're not familiar. We're about to start work, hopefully this spring. And it's going to be basically completely unrecognizable from this state, I think, by the time we're done. So you can stay tuned for updates on that and for hammers to start swinging. So as I mentioned, we have more than 20,000 individual items, from photos to correspondence to reports, books and publications, x-rays, scientific and medical equipment, clothing, handicrafts made by patients, and all kinds of local history ephemera, from baseball game tickets to winter carnival programs. The collection is largely made up of items related to the TB industry, but we're trying to encourage more donations about general Saranac Lake history as well, because people may not realize it, but our scope includes history from its early days as a logging hamlet to today. And that includes all the small towns and hamlets that make up the Saranac Lake Central School District, which is the largest geographically in the state, and includes Paul Smith's, Bloomingdale, Gabriel's, Onchayoda, etc. So cataloging is underway, in part due to funding from NILAN, yay, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services as well. And I'll talk a bit more about those projects at the end. But I always joke that I could talk about this stuff all day because I do, but I want to highlight 2 collections that we are working on processing and cataloging that I think have some really tremendous research potential. And you'll notice this very cool looking lady doing some research, so this could be you. So much of the end results of work done at the laboratory and the sanatorium were published in various formats, but I think there's some really fascinating history and research to be done on the process of the doctors and scientists actually carrying out the research. Both of the collections I'll talk about came to us actually through the families of those researchers, and they were both employed at the Saranac Laboratory at different points in its history and helped tell the story of the work that was going on there. So first up, we have Dr. Edward R. Baldwin. That's him as a young man standing on the steps of the Saranac Laboratory, and behind him you can actually see the Trudeau building. Dr. Baldwin came to Saranac Lake with TB after he attended Yale Medical School. And he had diagnosed his own infection by using a borrowed microscope. He was admitted to what was then the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium. And Dr. Trudeau was so impressed by his story that he offered him work in the Saranac Laboratory once he had recovered. They became close personal friends over years of working together, and Dr. Baldwin moved into a house across the street from the lab with his family. Following Dr. Trudeau's death in 1915, Dr. Baldwin established the Trudeau School of Tuberculosis. This was a 6-week program for physicians who could come up to train in the latest methods of TB detection and treatment, and then take what they had learned back to their hometowns. And around this time, he also started the Trudeau Foundation with an endowment for the study of TB. And again, just for fun, here he is in a fancy dress skating costume. which the fancy dress skating carnival was one of the founding attractions, contests of the winter carnival that's still going on today. So you can tell I've developed sort of a fondness for these guys as I work with their materials. But so one of the great things about the collection of Dr. Baldwin's materials is that it's also a family collection. So like the photo of him in fancy skating clothes, it helps us see his role in his family and his community here in Saranac Lake. The collection was donated to HSL in a few chunks over the last 4 years, and I suspect we might see some more additions in the future. But it contains records of Dr. Baldwin, his wife, Mary Ives Baldwin, there they are on their anniversary, their son, Henry Ives Baldwin, Dr. Baldwin's younger brother, Ernest, and his wife, Annie, the two of whom ran the Baldwin School. And as an aside, this school was a day school for children who were otherwise unsuited for regular classroom life, primarily due to illness or disability. So it's a fascinating family all around. The records also reflect their family life on Church Street, the history of the laboratory, the sanatorium, the Trudeau School and Foundation, and much more. There's a wide variety of records represented in the collection, especially photographs, as Mary was an avid photographer of daily life in Saranac Lake. And here I am. You can tell it was a few years ago by my hair, but here I am with the family going over the first segment of the donation, which was 6 or 7 records cartons full of material. And there is a finding aid and catalog records forthcoming, but for now I want to highlight one item from the collection to give you an idea of the research potential that I see. So first up is a bound manuscript of Dr. Baldwin's diary that he kept on a trip to the League of Red Cross Society's medical convention in France in 1919. Now, you can imagine that 1919 was a complicated time to travel to Europe, both in terms of the mode of travel, but also in a post-war landscape. Dr. Baldwin kept meticulous notes and took photographs on the trip and compiled his experiences in this diary. So for example, here is a spread from his visit to a children's sanatorium in the French Riviera. He noted that some of the children were injured or maimed during the course of the war, but that most of the children were afflicted with TB of some kind. He made note of the clothing they wore, the activities they participated in, and the general spirit of the children. He even managed to get in a joke making fun of Ford cars. So it's a fascinating diary and can be approached from many different angles. And here he is with the tuberculosis section of the conference. He's the second from the right in the back row. And these doctors and scientists came from all over the world to share their knowledge post-war in this setting. The diary is also accompanied by his travel documents, notes, and correspondence with his family back home. So up next is the collection of Dr. Leonard Bristol. That's him in the dark suit on the left. He's speaking to some Italian researchers, probably in the late 60s, judging by their clothing. I love his floral tie. It's always funny to me also to see these researchers discussing lung ailments while smoking pipes or cigarettes. So you can see in the bottom right corner, someone's holding a pipe. But I digress. Dr. Bristol did his residencies in medical school in radiology studies, which was relatively new focus at the time in 1949. And he developed an interest in occupational diseases of the lung and came to work at the Saranac Laboratory, where at the time they were researching not just tuberculosis, but also silicosis and other related diseases of the lung. So Dr. Bristol, while he was here, worked with others to develop a radiological classification for, and forgive me here, pneumoconiosis diseases. And that work has become a standard in the profession. During his time at the Saranac Laboratory, he was involved in studies commissioned by the Johns Manville Corporation and others on asbestos and diatomaceous earth and their effects on the lungs and body. He was called on to testify in many legal cases as a result. And just like the Baldwin papers, I also want to mention this is a family collection of papers, so they also offer us a slice of life in Saranac Lake at the time, including this photo of Dr. Bristol in the Winter Carnival Rotary Variety Show in the 1950s. I believe that's him with the big ears. So these Johns Manville studies, what do I mean by outrageous misconduct? Now the name Johns Manville might not be household anymore, but at the time they were the biggest producer of asbestos products in the world. They commissioned several studies from the Saranac Laboratory in the 1940s and 50s. And this is where the story depends on who you ask, of course, but these studies never saw the light of day. seems like a fairly straightforward conflict of interest now that we know what we know about the harmful effects of asbestos, but the research didn't surface publicly until much later. At that point, it was used in many legal cases against asbestos producers, and Johns Manville Corporation declared bankruptcy to protect itself against settlements from mine workers and their families. So this is where the outrageous misconduct comes into play. There's a great book on the topic by that name that examines the asbestos industry's handling of the dangers of the industry. So if you really want to get into it, that's a good read. These are just 2 pages from a report in the collection. You can see they're marked confidential. These are those reports that never saw the light of day at the time that they were would have been published. So because of Dr. Bristol's expertise on pulmonary diseases and his involvement in the studies, he testified in many different legal cases throughout the years. We have a number of depositions from some of those trials in the collection, but I think that the materials that are of most interest are his own copies of the studies, reports, and correspondence made in the process of working with Johns Manville. So you can see letters that executives at Johns Manville sent to the researchers at the laboratory, inviting them to come visit them in New York City and have lunch with their wives and so on. So it's really interesting to see how that relationship developed as well. And these particular copies have not been seen outside of the family for many decades. So this binder is just one of many that they gave to us. You can see it might be hard to tell the scale, but I believe this one was about 10 inches tall. And so there's a tremendous amount of material, again, that has not been explored, since it was in the family's possession. Dr. Bristol's collection also includes things like glass lantern slides of patient x-rays used in his studies. This is where I'm really excited to get researchers involved. I can recognize that these may be interesting objects, but I certainly don't know what I'm looking at. And so I think there's a great opportunity for research with these materials, and I look forward to having people in to explore them. I also want to mention that we received funding from the Pomeroy Foundation this year to purchase equipment that will allow us to digitize our glass negatives and lantern slides. This is a picture of our setup here. So we're hoping to get that project started really in earnest in the new year. But in the meantime, we're working on cataloging and then making those records available online. So speaking of cataloging, I want to talk a bit more about our collection in general and some materials that I hope you will come and use for research. As I mentioned, a lot of our focus has been on materials associated with the TB industry, from photos to correspondence to memoirs written by patients, things that accumulated over the course of more than 7 decades. We also have records of patients, cure cottages, and nurses and doctors who worked in the industry. On a more general history note, we have records of great camps and people who came to spend their summers on the Saranacs, including a group that came to us a few years ago related to Pinehurst Camp on Lower Saranac. We also have loads of Winter Carnival history, including photos, trophies, programs, committee records, and more. We have an oral history program that collects memories of Saranac Lake from TB to tobogganing. The majority of the recordings are now available online, so you can check them out from home. And then finally, another fascinating collection of materials, I think, is from the post office pharmacy. This is a huge collection, so we're still working on getting it in order and inventoried, but it includes prescription records going back to the late 1800s from a variety of independent pharmacies all over Saranac Lake and Bloomingdale. At the peak of the TB industry, there were about 13 of them, and as they closed one by one, they gave their records to each other. And so Post Office Pharmacy, being the last remaining independent pharmacy, basically accumulated them all. So it includes glass bottles and tools used in these historic compounding pharmacies, but it's also a ton of prescription records. So I can see a lot of cool research angles, such as looking at what kinds of drugs were being prescribed and by whom. So this is an example of one of the TB records of patients. This is our most common research request. We've gotten probably about 100 a year in the last 2 years. And unfortunately, the vast majority of patients who came here, the records have been lost for a variety of reasons. So what we do have is really precious. And so we've been working on cataloging and also transcribing these records to make it easier to search so that we can help people find information about their family members who were here And we got a grant last year from Nyland that helped us do transcription of a huge collection of these cards from the TB Society. But you can see they're full of all sorts of fascinating information, you know, from weight gain and loss to career to salary, all kinds of things like that. This is a great image of one of the 19 teens ice palaces. You can see they built some pretty serious ice palaces back in the day. And then this bottle is, I took this picture in the basement of Post Office Pharmacy. PAS is one of the first successful antibiotic cocktails that was prescribed to TB patients in the early 50s. And so it was really cool to see this bottle of PAS with a local pharmacy on it. And not only that, the pharmacist, his son was still running the pharmacy at the time when we came and took the material. So you've heard a lot of sampling of what types of materials and subjects are covered by our collection. So here's where the fun part begins, right? Using the collection. We handle research requests every day. They can be made virtually or in person by filling out a research request form at the museum. Like I said, we've been totally swamped with research requests on patients this last couple of years, as well as new donations to the collection. So we're working on a bit of a backlog, but now I have an awesome assistant who might help out, and she's here on this call to embarrass me. If you're unable to come do research in person though, excuse me. Sorry. We may require a scanning fee, but we can always talk about it depending on what kind of use you're talking about and publication, things like that. You can contact me in a variety of ways, either by email or phone, and I'm absolutely happy to help you get started on your research requests with our collection, or I can help point you in the direction of other sources that might help. So thanks to Nyland's support, we now have an online collection database for the first time. I want to stress that this is in no way a comprehensive list of items that we have. So if you're looking for something in particular and you don't find it, don't lose hope. But I am adding items to it every day. So there will always be something new to explore. One way I like to use it is to hit the random image button and see what comes up. And I cataloged it, but it's still fun for me. So I hope you enjoy it too. So also thanks to a 2-year grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, I'm hard at work cataloging photographs from our collection and publishing those records online. And again, thanks to Nyland, we're going to be digitizing a huge chunk of them and make them available on our catalog and on New York Heritage. We also have a pretty amazing resource that's always online. Some of you might be familiar with this, but our local history wiki is awesome, if I do say so myself. It's like Wikipedia, so anybody can edit or add to it, but it's always growing. These days, there are more than 6,500 pages, roughly, and they're all on topics of Saranac Lake area history. You can also find information about our collection scope and policies on our website, and you can also get a link to the wiki there. And hopefully, sooner than later, we'll have a public reading room where you can come use our collections by appointment in the Trudeau building. You can still use our collections in person in the meantime, but this will be an awesome dedicated space, and I'm very excited about it if you can't tell. And then as always, you can come visit us at the Saranac Laboratory Museum year-round and see the place where it all happened, get a full immersive experience being in the laboratory, and talk to us about your questions about Saranac Lake history. So I know I just threw a ton of information at all of you, but if anyone has any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them now, or you can email or call me if you heard something that piqued your interest. Are most requests coming from people doing ancestry searches? Do you mean ancestry.com, the website specifically, or genealogy generally? I mean, I can answer both of those. We don't have any resources. Oh, okay, in general. So we don't have any resources that are in Ancestry's databases, but people are certainly making connections that way. But generally, yes. TB is a bit of a genealogical black hole for a lot of people because there was certainly stigma attached to the disease at the time. And, for a long time they weren't sure how it was spread, which we know a bit what that's like today. And so a lot of times people would come here and nobody ever talked about it again. You know, more so, especially if they died up here. We get lots of requests from people who say, you know, my great aunt so-and-so, I think she was there as a patient, but nobody would ever talk about her. You know, it was a painful subject, I think, for a lot of families. And so, you know, I think that accounts for a lot of it. But also, you know, just generally, most patients were here for a year or two on average, some longer, some shorter. It was from what we have heard from patients, you know, an incredibly formative experience. And so, you know, it may have made a big change in their lives and changed the course of, you know, their career, their love life, their family, even where they lived. A lot of patients stayed here after curing. And so, you know, people are looking to find any sort of physical documentation of that time in their relatives' lives. And so, you know, it's disappointing, certainly when we can't find anything, which happens about half the time. But it's also helped us make some really interesting connections with people all over the world that I would never have occasion to talk to. And, you know, I think it's not hyperbole to say that you don't find a town of this size in a rural location with this much varied history and this many links to other places. For example, patients came in large numbers from Latin America, Cuba, you know, Puerto Rico. And so there was a pretty big Spanish speaking contingent, and Amy, our director, who's on the call as well, did a lot of research on the Spanish speaking patients. That's a subject that's near and dear to her. And so, you know, but just for example, Robert Louis Stevenson was a patient here. That would be like the equivalent of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a famous writer today, but, you know, Beyonce coming here, not quite that much, but, you know, he was definitely a household name at that point. And so that really put Saranac Lake on the map in a lot of ways. But, you know, many celebrities came from the vaudeville industry and the entertainment industry in general. The first democratically elected president of the Philippines died of TB while curing here. Yes, good one, Stephen King, thank you. So, you know, it's, you can fall down all sorts of rabbit holes in this research. And Jerry mentions marriages of patients. Yep, a lot of patients met their future spouses here, whether they were fellow patients or in some cases a nurse or a doctor. So, you know, it definitely had a profound impact, I think, on people's lives, and it makes every day very interesting here for me. Ellen asks, are there plans to compile patient information, et cetera, in a searchable database? Yes, but not a public facing one necessarily, for a whole bunch of reasons. There are privacy concerns, you know, with the information. You know, we're not covered by HIPAA, but they are technically all patients who were undergoing medical treatment. That was the reason they were here. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is that it's hard to search the names because maybe their handwriting is hard to read. Maybe in the case of the TB Society cards that we just transcribed, a lot of their names are obviously written phonetically by whatever doctor, nurse, secretary who was taking notes over the phone. So we're like, that's a weird way to spell that name. So you might have a Smith, but it's spelled Smyth, you know, whatever. So all that, you know, makes it difficult to search. So we are working on, I'm hoping to work with Nylan actually. This is just a great idea in my head right now, but on making a database that we can use at least internally that does searches that do near matches and sounds like matches to make it easier for the staff. And so, but as far as like publishing a full database online, you know, it's just not really that doable. So, you know, obviously, if we build a program like that to use internally, it makes our ability to search much faster. And so we can, you know, sort of pass that along to you, the requesters. Is there also information on Raybrook and Stonywall? Absolutely. So Raybrook was the in case you're not familiar, was the state-run TB hospital that's between here and Lake Placid. Stonewall was originally started as a sanatorium for women who could not afford care, a charitable organization. And so on the wiki, there are pages and pages about both facilities, including in Stonewall's case, for example, there was a young man whose mother was there, worked there, and he was more or less raised at the sanatorium. And there's a whole article he wrote on his memories of the sanatorium as a child. So the wiki is a great place to start. It is not everything, but it'll get you in the door. And then if you have further questions, you can absolutely reach out to me. And same thing, we have tons of photos of both those facilities. So you can search our collections database to see what we've cataloged already, but you can always, make sure to check back later. Thanks, Christy. And the wiki is always, available online for free. Again, there's a lot of rabbit holes to fall down, but it's a great resource. I use it every day because I don't know everything about Saranac Lake history, believe it or not. So it's a tremendous resource. We're happy that you all can use it. What happened during the last 15 years or so, 1950 to 64, when there was treatment for TB, did the patient load decrease and research die down? So the sanatorium closed in 54, and most of the other cure cottages and things at the same time. The antibiotic cures for TB were discovered in the late 40s, and then in popular use by the early 50s. And so that was really, the writing on the wall for the sanatorium. There's no need to spend a year in bed if you can take antibiotics in the comfort of your home. And so, the number of patients definitely decreased, and they still continued research on TB, and they still continue research on TB today, actually, in Saranac Lake and elsewhere. But the treatment course definitely shifted at that point, and that's why most of the sanatoriums closed. There's a really interesting article in Life magazine from December of 1954. That's the title is "A Victim of Progress," and it's about the closing of the sanatorium. And we have many copies of it here at the museum if you would like to read it. But it definitely changed the landscape for TB treatment, to be sure. Just as an example, we know that Raybrook Sanatorium stayed open into the late 60s, if not the early 70s. I can't remember the year off the top of my head. But it was because it was run by the state, the patients there didn't necessarily have the funds or access to medical care. And so they were more or less institutionalizing the patients there so that they would take the full course of antibiotics under supervision. Even today, the drug treatment for TB is, of course, a cocktail of antibiotics that you take for 6 months to a year. And TB is still around, and before COVID was the #1 infectious disease killer in the world. Taking 6 months to a year of antibiotics is rough. Anyone who has taken any antibiotics can imagine that, there are side effects. And so once you start to feel better from your tuberculosis symptoms, you don't necessarily want to keep taking medicine that makes you sick to your stomach or tired or whatever. And so a lot of patients would stop taking it. And that's why, in part, we have so many issues with partially or completely drug-resistant TB. So, that sanatorium facility gave patients, access to and supervision to take medication. So the story is a little bit different depending on facility you're talking about, but generally speaking, that was a very long answer to that question, sorry. But generally speaking, yeah, that was it for the sanatoriums. I'm compiling info on TB from the historic newspapers. Is there material on the State Department of Health and the SCAA with county TB hospitals? I don't know what the SCAA is. We have some materials about like Raybrook and things, but all the material, we haven't found any material with the state regarding the patients who were in care at Raybrook and other county hospitals. Oh, okay. Yeah, not that I'm really aware of. If you shoot me an email, I would be happy to talk to you a bit more about what I've looked into. But what we have from the state hospital is the records of a surgeon who was there for many years. He kept copies of all his surgery reports, and so that's a slice of it. But I haven't been able to turn up anything within the state. I'm as I said, with the opening of the reading room in the next 2 to 3 to 4 years, we're really going to be able to share the collection in a way we haven't before. But all the things that I'm working on to catalog and inventory and account for our collections are all going to sort of lead us to that point. So you'll see a lot more from us over the next few years in terms of material available online, whether it's digitized material or even just the written catalog records. So not to toot my own horn, but I'm real excited about it. So everybody stay tuned.
Again, thank you everyone for being here. Otherwise, thanks again, Chessie. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your Friday and a good weekend.
Thanks, Christy.
Have a good day. Bye.